Prior to 1980, this area was all a lot different. The ground level here was about 100 feet lower.
It's so dangerous tonight, so confusing on Mount St. Helens that even experts aren't clear what has happened.
If the volcano wants to erupt, that's its business. We don't control either the timing or the size or the nature of the eruption.
No, I'm not going to leave. You're damn right I'm not going to leave. I'm going to stay here.
The bodies they find show the people never had a chance to escape from the mountain's blast.
230 square miles of forest were blown down in 3 minutes. In 3 minutes.
So essentially we have the beginnings of an entire forest ecosystem out here that's established in the last 17 years.
You don't have to come to an active volcano. It'll come to you.
The beauty of the mountain was deceiving. Inspired by its perfect, snow-capped dome, explorers Lewis and Clark sent glowing praise clear across the continent to President Thomas Jefferson. They thought Mount St. Helens, perhaps the greatest pinnacle in America. The year was 1806, and by then, Native Americans had lived in its shadow for over 7,000 years. They had a different understanding of its power. They called it Fire Mountain. More precisely, Mount St. Helens was a time bomb. And in the spring of 1980, after more than a century of hibernation, the volcano awoke with a roar heard for 200 miles. In only a matter of seconds, the perfect dome crumbled, unleashing a supersonic lateral blast that leveled over 200 square miles of old-growth forest and launched 540 tons of ash and pumice 12 miles high into the atmosphere. It was the most destructive volcanic eruption in recorded American history. Yet the natural process of recovery had already begun before the hot debris had time to cool. Here was absolute proof that the Earth is still a planet in the making. The worst natural disaster occurring in the age of man is thought to have been a massive volcanic eruption 75,000 years ago on the Indonesian island of Sumatra. It left a scar in the earth 20 miles wide and 60 miles long. The ash exploded into the atmosphere, caused a global winter for several years. Despite a volcano's awesome power to destroy itself, along with almost everything in the neighborhood, geologists maintain it is actually serving a higher purpose.
Well, volcanoes certainly are just a critical part of Earth evolution, both in terms of land masses. There's a whole area of this continent that is just basically volcanic material. It's also important in terms of the atmosphere for getting gas from the interior of the Earth up to the surface, providing us with water, carbon dioxide, sulfur, and other gases that are important for life.
Given enough time, measured not in years but in millennia, fertility has always been enhanced by volcanic activity. Scientists who trace the history of volcanoes call it geologic reincarnation. To destroy itself, then build itself back up. This is a volcano's legacy.
To look at the volcanic history of any area, we end up looking at the layers of the surface beneath our feet primarily. For foresters, they can look at the growth rings of a tree and track the tree's history through time. For geologists, we look at the growth rings being the rock layers that were in place to be able to track the history of the volcano through time.
Mount St. Helens is actually the smallest volcano in the Cascade Mountain range of the American Northwest. It first erupted some 40,000 years ago. But it can't really claim credit for the kind of destruction that forever changes a planet.
But in the last 4,000 years, it's been extremely active. It's had some of the most explosive eruptions in the Cascades, and it's been the one that people have had their eye on quite a bit.
Despite its fiery reputation, the mountain has always attracted admirers. Its beauty was legendary, and it stood only 50 miles north of Portland, 100 miles south of Seattle. Summertime was high season. Mountain trails offered one exotic view after the next. Clear, cold, oxygen-rich rivers and mountain lakes were known for their salmon and steelhead. Amphibians, birds, mammals large and small, prey and predator. Even man and his timber cash crop. All thrived in a rich, self-sustaining ecosystem. By 1909, boys and girls were trekking halfway up the mountain to scout camps on the shores of Spirit Lake. Vacationing families frequented heavenly-sounding destinations like Harmony Falls Resort, Spirit Lake Lodge, and Truman's Mount St. Helens Lodge. Its colorful proprietor, Harry Truman, became a crusty but beloved local icon, spending 50 of his 84 years in the shadow of the volcano. Beneath the natural radiant beauty of the mountain, however, there were ominous signs pointing to the heart of the real legend. Layers of ash and hardened lava, black pieces of pumice and charred wood, and deeper yet, beneath the surface of the earth in places we have never seen. This is where volcanoes are born.
I don't think anybody really knows the point where magma leaves that really deep, deep reservoir. So there's a whole transit time from somewhere 100 to 125 kilometers up to fairly near surface of about 30 kilometers where we really don't have a way of tracking it or a way of seeing it. And so if you were to ask a little particle, when did it leave home, in essence, it would have quite a fascinating tale, and I wish we could do that.
Most land volcanoes erupt near the edges of the Earth's tectonic plates. These puzzle pieces of the Earth's outer crust are in constant motion, riding over and under each other, building enough pressure and heat to crush and melt the rock in their path. Now called magma, this super-pressurized mixture of melted rock and volcanic gas is squeezed upward through cracks in the Earth's crust. When it nears the surface, rising magma causes the ground to bulge, creating volcanoes. And when the pressure builds too high, the volcano will erupt. Moving at the rate of about an inch a year, it is the collision of the North American plate with the Pacific Ocean's Juan de Fuca plate that has created Mount St. Helens and the entire Cascade Range. Mount Rainier, Mount Hood, Mount Shasta. In fact, every major mountain in the Cascades. Each is a volcano with a violent past and the potential to erupt again. Of the 1,500 volcanoes in the world today, 550 are on land. 300 of those surround the Pacific Ocean, from Chile to California to Alaska, from Siberia to Japan to New Zealand. Volcanologists call it the Ring of Fire. It was in 1843 that Western settlers first witnessed and recorded an eruption of Mount St. Helens. 121 years after the volcano had gone back to sleep, in 1978, the United States Geological Survey issued a report warning of the probability of a new eruption. Within the next 100 years, and perhaps even before the end of the century. On March 20th, 1980, Mount St. Helens was shaken by the largest earthquake ever recorded at the mountain. At 4.2 on the Richter scale, it was only moderate in size, but its epicenter was very near the ground's surface. A sequence of harmonic tremors followed, smaller quakes caused by rising magma. Within a week, the mountain let off steam as the surfacing magma vaporized the glacial ice cap on contact. The news media had a field day.
Angry rumbling from Mount St. Helens again shattered the morning air over southwest Washington as continental America's first volcano in over half a century continues to roar.
These first steam eruptions left a crater 200 feet deep and 1,500 feet across. But even as these craters and cracks in the ice cap multiplied, grew deeper, and spread, the photogenic volcanic activity drew thousands of excited sightseers. Some of them christened the mountain Old Shake and Bake. At his home on Spirit Lake, just 5 miles beneath the north face of the summit, Harry Truman saw no need to panic.
Spirit Lake and Mount St. Helens is my life, folks. I've lived there 50 years. It's a part of me. That mountain and that lake is a part of Truman, and I'm a part of it. I wouldn't leave. You couldn't drag me out of the 10-mule team. I'm brave about the mountain. I couldn't understand how in the world the mountain could ever get me in Spirit Lake. I don't think it can.
However, a new 450-foot bulge was noted on the north face. By May 15th, it was growing at a rate of 5 feet per day, and the U.S. Geological Survey issued a new warning. An earthquake or eruption could trigger a massive avalanche that could threaten Spirit Lake and the Toutle River Valley.
How much farther can it go without gravity taking over?
Well, we don't know. And mainly because we don't know the strength of the rock and we don't really know the structure specifically within the volcano. So we don't know if we're very close to slides at this point or whether we're not close. And another critical thing that we do not know is whether or not it would go all in one grand motion or whether it would go in many small rock falls and avalanches.
Washington state authorities established a 20-mile red zone around the volcano, evacuating all but necessary scientific and enforcement personnel. Harry Truman refused to budge. School children wrote letters urging him to come down out of harm's way. Warming to his newfound celebrity, he did come down, but only to visit their classrooms, then always to return to his beloved mountain. Then, suddenly, the mountain became quiet. It was impossible to tell whether the volcano was shutting down or just gaining strength. On Saturday, May 17th, after a week without incident, cautious law enforcement authorities agreed to let anxious residents inside the red zone to check on their homes and businesses.
Governor Ray's position on this is that she wants to be of some assistance to the property owners and let you go in and at your own risk and take care of whatever you have to take care of. You're going to have to sign a waiver holding the state and counties harmless, and then we will, under police escort, take you in and we will bring you out.
If all went well, they would try it again tomorrow. That weekend, Longview resident Michael Moore went camping with his wife and 2 young daughters, well north of the mountain and outside the restricted zone.
And the volcano was the last thing on our mind at that point. We could have been camping in British Columbia as far as the volcano was concerned.
Valerie Pearson prepared to lead a Forest Service tree planting brigade to the south base of the mountain.
Mount St. Helens was so close, you almost felt like you could reach out and touch it. It was a beautiful sunny morning. We had a spectacular view of the mountain, and I was almost hoping that there might be a minor eruption so I could witness it.
Amateur photographer Gary Rosenquist drove down from Tacoma.
Yeah, hoping for an eruption, hoping to get some good pictures, but not really expecting anything.
6 miles northwest of the mountain, volcanologist David Johnston was stationed at the Coldwater Ridge observation site. It was his job to measure the bulging dome and radio back his reports to the USGS Volcano Observatory in Vancouver, Washington. "This mountain is a powder keg," he said. "The fuse is lit, but we don't know how long the fuse is." It wasn't long enough.
5 minutes before the eruption happened, this one great jay came by, and he was kind of hopping through our camp real weird, looked at us, and just boom, he was gone. He knew something was going on, and he thought we were nuts for just standing around.
At 8:32 in the morning, Sunday, May 18th, it was David Johnston's radio from Coldwater Ridge that alerted the world that the main event had begun. Gary's now world-famous photographs caught the volcano in full fury. Unexpectedly and tragically, the initial blast did not go skyward. Instead, exploded horizontally off the bulging northwest side of the dome at hurricane force. 6 miles away, Johnston's observation post was blown clear off the mountain and buried in the debris.
So when I saw the whole side of the mountain collapsing, I just went from real joy at taking some pictures to disorientation. And I was still taking photographs until I ran out of film. It was a manual camera, so I had to advance the film every time and hit it every time.
Within seconds of a magnitude 5.1 earthquake, the entire north flank of the mountain, 1 cubic mile of earth, disintegrated in a colossal avalanche. This triggered the lateral blast, the first and most lethal of many explosions of superheated volcanic gases, ash, and rock called pyroclastic flows.
Luckily the ash cloud was going sideways. It missed me by 1/3 of a mile. It was going about 300 miles an hour.
Though the blast was heard hundreds of miles away, those in the valley directly below the mountain heard nothing.
I didn't feel an earthquake. I didn't hear anything. There was no large blast. Just happened to look up and there it was. And at first I thought, oh, it's going to erupt. And then I realized the magnitude of the eruption.
It's impossible to describe the beauty of that cloud. It was roiling, is constantly mixing at a very, very fast rate, changing shapes with each blink of the eye. It was coming toward us much faster than it was going up.
Once the volcanic debris from the blast and pyroclastic flows fell to Earth, still heated to well over 1,000 degrees, they rushed down the mountain at speeds up to 200 miles an hour. And riding on heat waves above this boiling landslide, supersonic vapors of gas and pulverized rock, called pyroclastic surges, helped cut down, melt, or incinerate anything in their path.
I stopped and glanced over my shoulder and saw this enormous billowing cloud of ash coming, what it looked to be straight at us. And I thought, well, this is it. I'm going to be killed. And I thought, well, I don't want to have my back to it. I'm going to stand here and watch it.
Blistered by the heat, quakes, and landslides, Mount St. Helens' glacial mantle had melted and simply fallen away. Like burning wet cement, mud flows called lahars inundated the valleys and river basins under as much as 400 feet of boiling mud and rock. Trees were ripped from their roots. Buildings, trucks, and bulldozers were tossed around like tinker toys. And the intense heat ignited hundreds of small fires that melted the plastic parts on vehicles and machinery.
We were lucky to be at the spot that was chosen for us that day. We had been told that we'd have a 2 to 4 hour pre-warning before Mount St. Helens would erupt, but we didn't. I mean, we had no warning.
By midday, the ash had risen 12 miles high and begun to fall like winter snow over 22,000 square miles. Called Tephra-fall, it was blown eastward, casting an eerie darkness across 3 states. By noon, Yakima, Washington, 85 miles away, experienced midnight blackness. Four days later, the ash cloud had reached the Atlantic Ocean. In 2 weeks, it had circled the Earth. Indeed, the blast had reached well beyond the restricted red zone to the north.
If you projected a line from the center of the crater in the direction of the lateral blast, I think that line would have probably cut our tent in half. We were right in the mouth of the shotgun.
The Moore family spent the night shielded from the continuing eruptions in an old, rotten hunting shed. Mike, together with 4-year-old daughter Bonnie and his wife Lou, who carried their 3-month-old daughter Tara in her pack, began a desperate march through the decimated forest.
We'd been walking virtually nonstop for about 7 hours. Bonnie just kind of sat there in a daze. We wanted to try and cheer Bonnie up, so Lou took the camera, and I leaned up against a tree and said, "Come on, Bonnie," and she came over, and I said, "Smile for the camera," and I put on a smile which I really didn't believe in at the time, and Bonnie didn't smile in the first shot. The second one, she did. It's one of the best photographs I've seen.
It wasn't until well into the day, with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, drinkable water, and hope running out, that an Army rescue helicopter finally spotted them. The destruction to the surrounding landscape dwarfed even the most pessimistic predictions. In less than 3 hours, the raging southern fork of the Trudel River had swelled from its normal 200 feet to 1/3 of a mile and peaked at 21 feet over flood level. Carving a new riverbed in its wake, a 12-foot wall of water and blown down trees had obliterated anything in its path, and stranded citizens unable to seek higher ground. 17 pyroclastic flows had buried the valleys below under enough scorched earth to raise Spirit Lake 200 feet. Deep within the debris, the Shangri-La that was Harry Truman's venerable Mount St. Helens Lodge was now a gaping, steam-venting crater, bleeding off the enormous and continuous pressure that had caused the mountain to explode. When an awestruck President Jimmy Carter toured the disaster area by helicopter, he was quoted as saying, "The moon looks like a golf course compared to what's up there." The devastation was awesome. 221 houses, 27 bridges, 185 miles of road, 17 miles of railroad track, and one perfectly balanced ecosystem. Though the largest search and rescue operation in the history of the Northwest had saved 198 people from certain death, 57 lives were lost in the May 18th eruption of Mount St. Helens. The beautiful snow-capped peak was gone. In its place was a crater, 1.2 miles wide and 2.4 miles long. 1,300 feet had been carved from its 9,600-foot crest. Like a giant pressure cooker suddenly unleashed, the northern summit had exploded sideways with the power of a 10-megaton atomic bomb, 500 times the size of the Hiroshima detonation. In these high-altitude, infrared photographs, taken by NASA before the eruption, the pervasive green vegetation of Mount St. Helens' fertile environment appears dark red. After the eruption, all signs of life have been erased, extending far beyond what was considered the danger zone.
It was the very first time I drove into the blast zone. You kind of round this bend in the green forest and wham, you come out into this huge, vast expanse of just blown down trees as far as your eye can see. It just grabbed my heart. Mount St. Helens really helps people appreciate the power of the earth and respect that power of the earth. When they learned that enough earth fell off Mount St. Helens for every person on our planet to walk away with 15 buckets of Mount St. Helens, they suddenly look at the earth in a whole different light.
From that cataclysmic blast to the volcano's last steam explosions in 1992, over 21 separate periods of eruptive activity were recorded. Many were visible from Portland and even as far away as Seattle. But no new event approached the destructive capacity of the May 18, 1980 eruption. When most people think of volcanoes, they immediately conjure up fiery mental pictures of erupting lava. But lava flow has never been a great destructive factor in cascade eruptions. Mount St. Helens lava contains a high percentage of silica, the basic building block of volcanic rocks. Created from the rocky ocean floor, where oceanic tectonic plates are pressed under the lighter plates of the continental shelf. It is 1,000,000 times thicker than the rivers of molten lava erupted from Hawaii's Kilauea volcano. The Hawaiian Islands top a huge volcanic ridge that bisects the Pacific Ocean, though all but the tip is underwater. It is the world's largest mountain range. Miles below the surface of the ocean, this is the area where the Earth's tectonic plates recreate themselves and begin to push apart. The magma produced here is thought to originate deep within the molten core of the Earth. As Mount St. Helens magma broke the surface of the crater, it didn't flow. It oozed slowly and began to build lava domes. Some grew as big as 100 feet thick and 1,000 feet across. At first, they resembled giant stacks of lava pancakes. One was shaped like nothing so much as a giant muffin. Scientists christened it Muffy. By 1986, the last occasion of dome-building activity on the volcano, Muffy and her successors had added back over 900 feet to the crest, taller than a 77-story building and 40 times the size of Seattle's Kingdome Stadium. Historically speaking, this is truly one of the Earth's youngest geological features. Is Mount St. Helens still an active volcano?
We'd like to sort of reserve the term active for when it's actually in eruption. We use the term dormant to describe a volcano that we think one day again will be active, but isn't showing any signs of activity at present.
Today, the Cascade volcanoes are closely monitored by the U.S. Geological Survey and the University of Washington. Data is relayed immediately to a computer at the Cascades Volcano Observatory in Vancouver, Washington.
The main monitoring is seismic, and we have right now here 4 seismometers in the crater and on the outer flanks. It tells us everything we need to know for right now to warn us if there's going to be an increase in activity.
Though Mount St. Helens has helped bring the science of volcanology a long, long way, it's only an educated guess as to what the next major eruption will look like.
Now, at St. Helens, you've had a conduit that's been pretty warm for quite a while, so things might actually be able to sneak up the pike maybe more easily than they did back before 1980.
It's not as likely to be just a quiet dome-building eruption like we had in the late 80s.
But until it really makes that decision to reawaken, we can't say.
One thing, however, does seem assured. Lahars, or mudflows, will be a major factor. The dome's new magma cork is now covered by a heavy snow and year-round ice buildup. If magma reaches the crater's surface, this young glacier could melt within 10 minutes. Flooding and avalanches would not only be predicted, they would be certain. If Mount St. Helens stands as a monument to Mother Nature's awesome destructive powers, it is no less a prime example of her healing powers as well. Here, in the shadow of a volcano thought to have virtually wiped out every living thing in its wake, both plants and animals have re-emerged.
When we first came out here right after the eruption, there was nothing out here but rocks and fine sediments. And even something as innocuous as a spider web. We'd be out here in a whole area and we'd see it, and that would be a big event. We'd say, "Oh, we found a spider web!" And our entire data sheet would have this big exclamation mark across it.
When I was working in the crater in the early 80s, there were lots of signs that animals had returned. And there were animal tracks in some of the stream canyons, there were birds and butterflies, and in the early 80s we even saw little ground squirrels scurrying across the crater floor, stealing snacks from our lunches.
Perhaps there is truth to the concept that the small and the meek shall indeed inherit the earth.
Mount St. Helens gives us a chance to kind of reflect back on what much of this region must have looked like thousands of years ago. Here we have a chance to see that process of step-by-step development of a forest from scratch. We get to watch it from the ground up.
Since the volcano erupted in late spring, much of the area was still blanketed by snow. Shade-tolerant plants with prolific root systems, ground-hugging vegetation, and even small trees whose branches were bowed under heavy snowfall were insulated from the intense heat and the blast of the eruption. Uncovered from the volcanic debris as late as 3 years after the eruption, some were still able to grow and germinate. The towering evergreens in the blast zone, however, were helpless against the full force of the eruption. Since it takes at least 200 years to fully develop an old-growth forest, the Forest Service began replanting immediately. 18 million new trees. Now, 17 years later, areas of the young forest are 20 to 30 feet high and already need to be thinned.
One of the ways that we can tell how the forest is doing and what's happened through time is to mark places and then come back repeatedly year after year. And in that way, we can actually come in, like this stake here and mark a place, and that way we know we're coming back to the same spot. Each stake has a number, and we can then measure a distance around it and come back repeatedly through time and watch the growth of these willows and alders here and essentially track the development of the forest from the ground up.
But living through the blast is only the first hurdle towards the plant's survival. Erosion, drought, and the sun's burning rays take their toll, as do foraging wildlife, like elk, deer, and the voracious northern pocket gopher. By far, the most devastated area was the northern base of the volcano. Now called the Pumice Plain, it was first scoured by the lateral blast and temperatures as high as 1,200 degrees. Then, it was buried under 250 feet of landslide, ash, and pumice. Though a most inhospitable environment for the beginnings of new life, scientists watched as one prairie lupine plant gained a foothold. Its roots contain tiny bacteria-forming nodules that draw nitrogen, the key ingredient missing in volcanic ash, directly from the atmosphere. Soon, that one plant became a small colony of prairie lupines. It in turn provided food and shelter for the tons of insects and seeds that sail in on the wind every year. These little islands of life multiplied and grew together to provide enough nutrients for all kinds of other plants. And as the plants matured, the animals that feed on them returned as well. And the droppings of all these animals further sowed the ground with more seeds and nutrients. Elk and deer from surrounding areas were seen in the blast zone within days after the eruption. They sought water from the backcountry lakes, some of which, despite the barrenness around them, were teeming with life.
Many lakes in the area of Mount St. Helens on the morning of May 18th were still partially covered by ice. And when the volcanic materials began to fall into the water, the effect of that material was very, very slight. That was in strong contrast to the areas all around the lakes that might have the trees completely blown down. The result of this is that a lot of animals, for example, frogs and salamanders, that were just beginning to begin spring courtship, were able to complete courtship in a perfectly normal way. And that set the scene for later in the summer, where you could see thousands of salamander larvae and frog tadpoles in the lake while you were standing in the midst of a forest that had been completely denuded.
Now, nearly 2 decades later, new discoveries can still be made on a hike through the blast zone.
At Mount St. Helens, things never stay the same very long. We see changes every year. Some of them are big, some of them are small. Back in 1980, of course, was a big change when the mountain erupted and a huge debris avalanche filled the valley here with over 100 feet of rock and debris. This whole valley that we're sitting in now was 100 feet lower back in 1980. Then, back just a few months ago, some beaver came into the area. They hadn't been in here prior to this last winter, and their work this winter has resulted in a series of small dams, plus the ponds that are forming behind them. This means we have a whole new series of wildlife habitats for ducks, for fish, for salamanders. All kinds of life will be making this new pond their home this year.
Other wetlands, however, haven't been so hospitable. Just beyond the Pumice Plain, so much of the volcano slid into Spirit Lake that it rose 200 feet in a matter of minutes, splashing giant waves 400 feet up the surrounding ridges that washed even more soil and trees back into the lake. Explosions of steam and ash blasted small craters along the shoreline for weeks after the eruption. And temperatures higher than 1,000 degrees depleted the most important element of a healthy lake, oxygen, creating a kind of primordial soup. Still, not everything died. Archean bacteria, similar in structure to fossil organisms found in 3 billion-year-old Precambrian rock, led the recovery. Feeding on pure minerals jettisoned from deep inside the earth, they in turn provided sustenance for algae and insects blown in on the wind. Biologists were stunned to find the lake clearing and returning to life in less than 5 years.
And just a few years ago, we found the first fish in Spirit Lake, and we think that fish came from fish that survived in a high mountain lake that was covered with ice. The young of those fish washed down in the stream into Spirit Lake, and now there are good-sized trout in Spirit Lake.
Is this how life began on Earth? And is it happening on so many other planets, where astronomers have detected signs of volcanic activity and the possibility of hospitable atmospheres? Could the study of a volcano, like Mount St. Helens, help unlock the keys to finding other life in the universe? Over the last 500 years, over 500,000 people have been killed by volcanoes. In the 1980s alone, more than 28,000 are known to have died. Of those, Mount St. Helens took 57. Soon after that eruption, the United States Geological Survey created the Volcanic Crisis Response Team, dedicated, highly trained experts ever ready to go anywhere in the world to help predict and warn of volcanic threats.
What we've learned from Mount St. Helens, we have fine-tuned in responses to volcano crisis around the world. The Pinatubo eruption in 1991 is a fine example of that. The team from here, working with the local volcano observatory in the Philippines, was able to give out an early warning of that eruption, which allowed 15,000 military personnel from the U.S. and upwards of 50,000 local residents to be evacuated. Very few lives were lost in that compared to what would have happened had we not been able to predict that eruption.
Damage estimates for the Mount St. Helens 1980 eruption topped $3 billion. Beginning only 2 days after the initial blast, its cleanup became the largest project in the history of the Army Corps of Engineers. It took 5 months of pipeline dredging to fully restore the Columbia River shipping channel, where 45 million cubic yards of material had flowed 67 miles from the mountain. The citizens of Kelso and Longview, Washington, had been inundated by floods and mudflows. To keep those channels clear, the Army Corps constructed an earthen dam on the Toutle River, capable of trapping 250 million cubic yards of sediment. But the aftermath of a volcano is much more than just an engineering problem. All the volcano's neighbors, victims and rescuers alike, must put their lives back together again. Helping each other to look forward to the future while not forgetting the past. Most were not as fortunate as Valerie Pearson. Just after having outrun the volcano and making it back safely to her base in the town of Cougar, Washington, she met a young man, a forester like herself, who helped her regain her usual calm.
We drove down off of Mount St. Helens and ended up watching Mount St. Helens erupt for the rest of the day. 2 years later, I ended up marrying him. So that was the day I met my husband. I remember thinking as I drove up Spirit Lake Valley the very first time working for the Forest Service and just finishing college and starting my forestry career, how would I meet, the man I was going to marry? How many kids would I have? Where would I live? And I guess it took a volcanic eruption to bring us together.
In 1982, the United States Congress set aside 110,000 acres of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest as the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument.
The scientists at Mount St. Helens are really incredible people because they've recognized the importance of communicating their findings. And they found great ways of making the information they present at Mount St. Helens kind of fun, entertaining, and easy to understand.
It is also their sacred mission to protect the volcano's environment, allowing the natural process of the volcano's recovery to continue unimpeded and unimpaired. Throughout the monument, visitor centers exist, each with a different and special emphasis on the volcano's history, its ecosystem, and its future. A recent addition, the Johnston Ridge Observatory, named for USGS volcanologist David Johnston, was dedicated May 17, 1997, the eve of the 17th anniversary of the Mount St. Helens eruption that took his life.
The first time I came to Mount St. Helens and was walking out on the deposits from the 1980 eruption, I just had this sense of this being incredibly unique and like no other place on Earth that I at least had ever been. And I have that same feeling now. It's just a unique spot on Earth.
As long as people live and play in the beautiful shadow of an active volcano, we may be exposed to eruptions with far-reaching consequences at any time. With that very firmly in mind, it is the U.S. Geological Survey's mission to keep natural occurrences from becoming natural disasters. Once again, the volcano's mountain trails welcome hikers, campers, and adventurous tourists. Those climbers intrepid enough to trek up the southern slope to the dome will be rewarded by awesome views of the valley below and magnificent vistas of neighboring Cascade volcanic peaks rising in the distance. But even more awe-inspiring, there is the sight of moss, green plants, and even willow growing out of the steaming lava bed. In all its splendor and horror, Mount St. Helens is, above all, a monument to the power of nature, whose breath both consumes and gives life.
But I'd like to think that there's a sign at the edge of the blast zone, God's country under construction.
For change is the only constant, and only one thing is certain: the volcano will erupt again.